Madam Chair, once again, I think every time a board member speaks, you provide additional wisdom to this very important conversation. I have to say that speaking about next year, and we didn't really focus too much on next year, but I promise you over the next few months, I will, and I think you will join me on this journey. Because for next year, and it's regrettable that that the appropriate megaphone in terms of mass media is not here today covering this conversation. For next year, there is a sad expectation that with the shift to more complex, more in-depth, more difficult, and also more college and career-ready standards with that transition, and I support higher accountability and higher standards. It's good for kids, it's good for our community, it's good for the economy. But I believe that the state did not do and continues to do insufficient preparation at all levels. At the stakeholder level, at the business community level, at the parent level, at the community level, at the teacher and leader level, and even at the school board member level. I don't know how much communication you received directly from the state in terms of a media awareness campaign to sensitize everybody to the fact that the new standards are very different from the last standards. Secondly, so that's my first concern, is that the shift from the current standards to the new so-called Florida standards has not been adequately conveyed to the community. I think we're in for a shocker. Secondly, the assessment piece. You cannot manage what you can't measure. I'm there, right? You cannot manage what you can't measure. And that certainly is appropriate to be said about assessment necessities in our district, but is it not true as well to be applied to, or appropriate to be applied to Tallahassee, to the Department of Education? How can we manage a new assessment that will be revealed to us much later in the school year without us having the opportunity to measure ourselves with different versions of that assessment prior to it being delivered and presented to our students? And you have to understand my deep concern about this. There is currently no assessment. There is currently no assessment ready for this coming school year. We rely on interim assessments provided to our students throughout the year for us to gauge their readiness towards the final assessment. The only thing that has been provided to districts are sample items. And over the 4th of July long weekend, I sat and I went through, I actually emailed Gisela for her to forward to me the link to those items. And I sat and I looked at 3rd grade, 4th grade math, primarily some reading, and I'm okay with that. What I'm not okay with is that as of now, there is no assessment. When the assessment is in fact completed, I do not believe that the state will have enough time to test it for validity and reliability. They will not have time to engage in a field test examination. Therefore, the ability of the state to develop data, baseline data, prior to the first year of actual examination will be robbed from our students and our teachers. And I know this for a fact. There is no time because the state does not have another fallback to position in terms of an assessment. The state made a decision to discard all other options and go with AIR. AIR did not have an assessment off the shelf to provide. That assessment is being put together right now. It is being field tested not as a complete assessment, but as independent questions, not in the state of Florida. It is being field tested in Utah, recognizing the demographic similarities between Utah and the state of Florida, particularly Miami. So the huge nightmarish condition that's being created, particularly recognizing, and you heard me say up front, I believe in accountability and assessment. But accountability is only correct to the extent that it informs, supports, and improves instruction. with all these uncertainties during this transition, from what we know are dramatically different standards, without adequate information, and without an assessment that already exists and has been field tested in the state of Florida, I see it as pretty reckless. I have conveyed to the state my sentiment. I can tell you every single superintendent across the state of Florida agrees, and I think the day of reckoning is going to come when either the state does not meet the timeline or there is an assessment, but the fact that the assessment as provided to our students, since it bypassed the necessary statistical examination for the test of validation and reliability, if that is skipped, then the fact that legislatively, statutorily, there is such strong ties between student achievement data, teacher evaluation, and then teacher performance pay. My concern is that short of absolute validity and reliability, the house of cards comes down. And we're pleased with this year's results. We feel the transition going to next year is a dramatic one. I support the transition in terms of the standards. I think it's being accomplished too quickly. They've gone too far, too quickly, without enough adaptation time, transition time. And my concern, members of the board, is that next year, even though we had asked for a 1 to 2 year, actually a 2-year reprieve, 2-year transitional period, the state gave us a 1-year transitional period. I appreciate that. The Department of Education, I'm not talking about the legislative body. This is the Department of Education. But they insist still on giving school grades, letter grades, when across the state everybody knows pretty much what will be happening. And to allow that to happen at a time when you see a surge of improvement, but that improvement may not be recognized in terms of the data that comes out because of the potential inadequacy of the assessment, because it has not been validated here, is something that we're concerned about. Finally, you know me as the consummate optimist. I believe that the impossible can in fact become the inevitable. So I'm going to be asking you in weeks and months to come to support this ongoing conversation that may see not a dramatic change, but a recognition that there's a better way of getting to the same destination. And that's ultimately what we want. Thank you very much once again for the opportunity to speak about this very important matter.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Perez?
Thank you very much for that eye-opening presentation, Mr. Superintendent. And it just defies logic that we would take our children and put them in harm's way almost, having an assessment that has not been validated and has not been tested for its reliability. And I'm just curious, Mr. Superintendent, I heard you say that you are optimistic in spite of the news that we've heard. But what do you suggest that we as a board do to prevent this house of cards from collapsing?
Thank you very much for the question. That's a very easy solution, and I'm going to reveal what my strategy is to a certain extent. Look, if over the past 2 years the state decided and imposed a transition of standards, and in fact our teachers were asked to teach Common Core standards, Florida standards, knowing that the assessment was going to be the FCAT, why not, as you fully transition now to the Florida standards, Common Core, why don't you continue to assess for 1 transitional year on FCAT as you transition? It's no different. So you have a hybrid teaching methodology as you continue the transition. Secondly, you need to suspend the obsession with the school grade. Only that way do you preserve 2 things. Number one, the legitimacy of the accountability system that has worked well for the state of Florida. And secondly, the connections between student achievement, teacher evaluation, and teacher pay. You cannot disrupt that. If, in fact, a teacher performed better this year than last year, but overall the performance goes down and it's not recognized. Is it fair? I think anybody and everybody would say, no, it's not. So that needs to be recognized. So I think the shortest answer is continue an extension of the hybrid teaching model, and there's nothing wrong. I'm not promoting a continuation of FCAT, but there is an assessment now. There is an assessment now. You should not jump ship until such time as you have a fully vetted exam. The additional thing that can be done is an extension of a transition not only of suspending the consequences, which the state did agree to do, associated with the accountability system, but in fact, if nothing else is done, don't only suspend the consequences, suspend or modify the recognition of the school grade. We should not repeat. I'm going to ask you to remember for a second when we were in the first phases of our digital convergence, and we were reaching decisions regarding device deployment. Remember those days? And device acquisition. We paid close attention to the implosion of a different model in Los Angeles. Remember that? And I said, it may be a little confusing or painful, but we best press the pause button rather than stepping on the same landmine that others already did. And we did that. And as a result, we were able to learn from their mistakes, regroup, and come up with a better implementation plan, which, by the way, the rest of the nation is paying close attention to the way we're doing it. There is already a precedent setting that has been established in terms of a very large district attempting a one-year transition in terms of standards from legacy standards to Common Core with assessment, and that's New York City. The leader, the national leader of the Common Core movement and assessment advised New York against that quick transition. Others have advised, including Washington, D.C., who is seen as this very proactive district in terms of teacher evaluations and the like. They have said, in light of this rapid transition of standards, we're going to suspend our reliance on them for teacher evaluation because we're very concerned about the ability to justify all these judgment calls regarding teacher evaluation, performance pay, when we're in the midst of a transitional year of accountability, of standards and assessment. So using the New York school system as a recent precedent, where there's been terrible mayhem in terms of what the data has produced and the shaking of the system as it exists right now, I think the state ought to pay close attention and not allow that to repeat itself here. We already know probably what will happen here, and there's a better approach to safeguard the accountability system. Look, I go back to the early years of the A-plus plan, Governor Bush's A-plus plan. Whether you agree with the policy or not, whether you like it or not, whether you support it or not, here's what the governor did. He did just what we're asking now. During that transitional period, even though the statute passed specific to school grades, during the transitional period, during 2 years, the law was in place, but there were no school grades because he knew that one of the greatest consequences or dangers to the accountability system itself was such a shock that would compromise the idea itself. I think Florida has a short memory by failing to recognize how it was done better before and failure to do so, what that has resulted in other districts north of us. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Perry?
Yes, thank you again, Mr. Superintendent. And I agree that suspending the consequences is just not enough because our parents, our community, the consequences, they stick, and they stick in a very hurtful way. And I just am very impressed, Mr. Superintendent, with your explanation of one of the solutions that could be found. And I'm wondering how much support you think we would have if there is a continuing of the FCAT and a hybrid model for the future year.
I'd like to defer to Ms. Field, if I understood your question correctly.
What support is there?
I'm sorry?
Is
What-
there support?
There's ample support across the state on the stakeholder side. So if you're a superintendent, a board member, a teacher, a principal, you're very supportive. On the State Board of Education side, there was support for a transitional period, but they decided to, instead of giving us 2 years, which was what I initially advocated for, they gave us 1 year. I am certainly hopeful that at the very least, Dr. Perez, at the very least, that they do what we do. There needs to be an interim assessment of the progress towards the AIR assessment. If the assessment isn't ready, if there's no ability to test it here in Florida with Florida students and Florida teachers, then I think it would be reckless to proceed with only 1 transitional year rather than 2, depriving us from the ability to test it here. So there's a great deal of support on the stakeholder side at all levels, board, superintendent, and educators. I think the parents are there as well. Support from the State Board of Education in terms of expanding the 1 to 2 year transition and creating a hybrid assessment model, and at the commissioner level is uncertain at this point. But again, I don't think that they, and I'm going to blame myself in part, because I think I was forceful up front, but when they decided to go with 1 year transitional period, and then a while later they advertised nationally for the assessment, when they made a decision about AIR, and then not that long ago made announcements or revelations regarding the trial periods to be conducted in Utah, I don't think we've been as aggressive in pushing back on that. And I think we have an opportunity to do, and actually not only an opportunity, but I think an obligation, if we see the train wreck coming, of actually advising the state. I want to be clear again, because sometimes when you speak about accountability and assessment, people have selective hearing, right? They only hear part of it. I support accountability.
Absolutely.
Okay? You can only manage what you are able and have the courage to measure. But we must support and demand reasonable and respectful accountability that is well-rooted in principles of statistics that are reliable and valid and appropriately tested with the students and the population that this exam for years to come will be provided and given to.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Superintendent. Anyone else? Dr. Feldman, sir?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I agree. Excellent conversation and explanation. I thought I heard at the press conference you mentioned, or if not there, you've mentioned several times, and I think it's important that the people listening to this understand. Next year, you said we have to, by state law, be involved in performance pay, utilizing part of that test. Is that correct? No?
Through the chair, I'd like to defer to Ms. Wiseman, and the question is, by next year, I know the answer, but I think you probably can add additional specificity to the answer. By next year, there's a statutory requirement that performance, not necessarily performance pay, in fact, that the new compensation schedule, I'm not going to mention steps, compensation schedule take into account a percentage of the potential increase driven by student achievement data. With that said, Ms. Wiseman, through the chair.
Through the chair, the law says that the new compensation schedule has to go into effect July 1, 2015. We're currently in process of negotiating with United Teachers of Dade.
Okay. Thank you. The only reason I asked was if it's an invalid thing, it gets us all worried.
Right.
So.
And through the chair, we run different timelines that should run parallel, right? So the accountability shift, standard shift, that's one timeline, that's one train. The other train is the assessment change, right? That's a timeline. And then the other train is the evaluation / performance of teachers. That's driven based on state statute on the first two. You hope that the first train arrives at the station well before the second train. We ought to know what the standards are before we decide to create an exam to test those new standards. And we hope that the second train arrives at the station well before the third train, which is the evaluation and the performance implications on teachers. It's just fair. It is not right to tell you on the first day of the game, hey folks, I don't know what you trained for, but we're going to start the game, and you are disqualified if you don't perform, even though we did not tell you what the rules of engagement are. So it's an issue of fairness, of transparency, of legitimacy, and reasonableness that I think we're advocating for.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else from board members? Dr. Benders-Mendengal, ma'am.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And having listened to all of the conversations, remarks, I just have a few comments to make and maybe a question or two. I am very concerned that the pockets of, I don't want to say failure, but the pockets of concern, when you talk about the fragile schools, I have not asked for any information, and I apologize for not being at the press conference, but I should say for my listeners and for others, I was at a memorial for a beautiful child who was gunned down on her front porch. So I wanted to make sure that all of our constituents understand that they're, not only are the schools fragile, the lives are fragile, and the children, or the lives of our children are at stake. And I want to ask Mr. Superintendent and staff if there is an opportunity, or if we've looked at all of the people who touch the lives of the children who live in those certain zip codes, if we have reached out to them to ask them to be a part of some of the strategies and some of the thoughts. And I say this because, as you know, we have so many different languages in our school system and in our communities. I know those who are listening might understand what we're doing, but a lot of them don't. So I want to make sure that our parents who are in those fragile communities know what we're talking about, and they must be put on notice also. So they must understand what is happening. And I know we have a lot to do, but it requires a lot when parents, let's just say 2 or more generations, have not been well educated. So when we start talking with them about this level, or get it on this level of conversation, I don't know if they can engage in what we're talking about. I heard someone mention that it is harmful and hurtful. It is more than that. It's a time where if you've never had a heart attack, you don't know what is happening to you sometimes. You just feel as if you can't do what you want to do. You know that I heard someone say something this morning about tears. Well, that's a constant for some of us because we don't know how we can help them. We know that if we don't educate them, what's going to happen to them? It's not going to be pretty. So I think that we need to engage everyone in these pockets to sit down, and I don't know whether we need a retreat with them. I don't know. But I'm willing to say that they would be probably delighted to be engaged in some of the conversations. We need to put them on the team to help our children. The populations that suffer this news that we're listening to now usually are the same year after year after year. We might have added some populations, but I know some of them are the same. I want to know, Mr. Superintendent and others, if we plan, and I do remember you coming to the Caleb Center and going to other places. I was there. But do we have we looked at visiting some of these communities and sharing with the parents this information and engaging them in conversations? I say to you and to everyone who's listening, they care. They want their children educated. the group that I honored this morning, some of them said to me that they learned to read by reading to the students. They talked about preparing their lessons to go into the schools. Now, we all know, if you look at them, you can tell that some of them had to have life changes. But they have decided that in order to make our communities better, they've got to be involved in making them better. So I just want to know if we will have an opportunity to share with some of these parents, not just at board meetings, and of course, going into the communities and sitting with some of them. They don't have to be large groups. But we've got to let them know before they get what is called the report card that their children are in dire straits, and we must take them to the news. It might not be good, but then some of it will be good. So I offer this question: do we have thoughts about going into some of the communities and sharing what some of us have heard today?
Thank you for the question, through the chair. Dr. Bendros-Meningal, that is, it's not only a question, it's a moral imperative for all of us. Not only a question, but a moral imperative. We know where the fragile schools are. The fragile schools, by and large, are in fragile communities that face incredible adversity and challenge that should never be interpreted, however, as excuses for performance. But they're realities, right? And you rest assured that our plan already contemplated that. The plan that will be perfected tomorrow will amplify a reliance on parental and community engagement and social agency engagement and faith-based engagement, because you and I know that all hands on deck produce results. And you have my commitment, not only as I provided earlier to Dr. Feldman when he made his comments, that yes, we're going to have these conversations across the community, not only about this year's performance, but the anticipation of what next year will be like, what the challenge is, and what our joint obligation in support of these children, the schools, and yes, the teachers and the principals who are doing incredible work under really tough conditions. So count me in, just like I know I can count you in, because you're there when I show up.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Ms. Castillo?
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Superintendent, thank you very much for explaining this. I had a lot of questions about, as we're going into this year, what was happening, how our students were going to be evaluated, what if our parents were being informed. So thank you so much for explaining this in depth. I heard that you gave us two different options for looking into next year, two different options that the state could consider. And I know we've been having these conversations, and sitting here as a board member, it's hard for me not to wonder and ask, how can we avoid this train wreck? How can we go into the school year, and what can we do as a board to avoid this train wreck?
Well, the best way to avoid a train wreck is not by getting on the train, I guess, or to stay out of the railroad track. Unfortunately, we're not driving the train, and the railroad track doesn't belong to us. However, I gave you two potential scenarios at a 70,000-foot level. I think the conversation we're going to go into tomorrow is going to touch on this as well. And I promise you that at the earliest possible opportunity, next committee meeting, next board meeting, I think we ought to revisit this issue. We actually ought to revisit this issue until we have certainty about assessment decisions made statewide, and what you can possibly do to avoid the train wreck is as we bring more specific, more detailed, in-depth recommendations. And recommendations not just to you, but recommendations to the state of Florida, to the State Department of Education, and to the Commissioner, that we could benefit from your support and your voice, particularly some of you who are connected with statewide associations, to bring about a heavier voice with those who actually right now are in control of the train and the track.
you.